There is a machine that protects American interests across the Middle East. It runs on a simple principle: put troops where adversaries do not want them to be. But this machine has a hidden cost. Every soldier placed forward becomes a sensor, a signal, and a target. The protection creates the vulnerability. This is the architecture of vulnerability. And it explains why American troops die in places most Americans cannot find on a map. The United States maintains approximately 900 troops in Syria. They are not there to conquer territory. They are not there to fight a war of regime change. They exist as a tripwire, a strategic term that requires immediate explanation. A tripwire is a small force positioned deliberately to trigger a larger response if attacked. The logic is deterrence through risk. An adversary calculating an attack must weigh not just the immediate target, but the inevitable retaliation. The 900 troops in Syria represent a commitment. If you strike here, you strike the United States, and the United States will respond at scale. This system has operated for decades across multiple conflicts. Tripwire forces served in Cold War Germany, in South Korea, and across the Middle East. The mechanism is proven, but the mechanism has changed. The adversary has changed, and the cost calculation has inverted. To understand the strike that killed American troops, one must first understand the base they occupied. Military installations in Syria follow a specific architecture. They are not permanent fortresses. They are expeditionary nodes, temporary positions designed for flexibility rather than survivability. This is not a design flaw. It is a design choice driven by the political constraints of the deployment itself. The United States maintains its Syrian presence without formal host nation permission from Damascus. The legal basis rests on counterterrorism authorization, not treaty. This creates operational limitations. Permanent construction signals occupation. Expeditionary posture signals temporary intent. But temporary structures offer limited protection against modern threats. Base hardening, the military term for physical protection, follows a cost curve. Hardening against mortar fire requires sandbags and reinforced structures. Hardening against ballistic missiles requires specialized shelters. Hardening against drone swarms requires integrated air defense, electronic warfare systems, and persistent surveillance. Each escalation in threat demands exponential investment in defense. Here is the economic reality that shapes the architecture of vulnerability. A sophisticated military drone costs between $10,000 and $50,000. A single Patriot missile, one standard interceptor, costs approximately $3 million. The math is asymmetrical by design. The attacker can afford to lose dozens of drones. The defender cannot afford to fire dozens of interceptors against every threat. This is not a budget constraint alone. It is a structural constraint that shapes strategic choices. The Syrian bases rely on a layered defense. Short-range systems for immediate protection, combined with early warning and rapid response. But layers have gaps. Drones fly low, slow, and in coordination. They approach as a swarm multiple simultaneous threats from multiple vectors. Defense systems prioritize. They calculate. They engage the highest threats first. This creates openings. The architecture of vulnerability extends beyond physical protection to the personnel themselves. Troops in forward positions rotate through. They maintain equipment. They gather intelligence. They train partner forces. They exist as presence. Presence is the mission, but presence requires exposure. Consider the intelligence function. Forward troops observe. They monitor adversary movements. They provide early warning for regional threats. This function requires positioning near the threats being observed. The closer the observation, the greater the exposure. The system demands proximity. Proximity creates risk. The strike that killed American troops did not occur in a vacuum. It occurred within a system designed to project power with minimal footprint. That design succeeded in projecting power. It failed in protecting the projectors. This is not operational failure. This is structural tension. The architecture of vulnerability also serves diplomatic purposes. Visible troop presence signals commitment to allies. Kurdish forces in Syria, Iraqi security elements, and regional partners all observe American positioning. Withdrawal signals abandonment. Presence signals reliability. But reliability requires bodies in vulnerable places. The Middle East has transformed strategically since the architecture was established. The primary adversary was once terrorist organizations, non-state actors with limited reach. The current adversary is a state, Iran. Iran operates through proxies, but commands state resources. Iran manufactures drones domestically. Iran supplies these drones to allied militias across the region. The threat has scaled up, while the defensive architecture has not. Iranian strategy understands the cost equation. They have observed American defensive limitations. They have tested responses. Each probe, each drone approach, each rocket barrage, each swarm deployment generates data. The data reveals gaps. The gaps create opportunities. The opportunities lead to strikes. The base that suffered the fatal strike represented a known vulnerability within a known system. Its location was not secret. Its defensive capabilities were estimated. Its personnel count was approximated. The architecture of vulnerability does not hide its weak points. It accepts them as the cost of strategic positioning. But this acceptance has limits. The tripwire function requires credibility. An adversary must believe that attacking the tripwire triggers devastating response. If the tripwire burns without consequence, the deterrent dissolves. The architecture collapses. The troops become not signals of commitment, but evidence of impotence. This is the strategic trap. Presence creates vulnerability. Vulnerability invites attack. Attack requires response. Response risks escalation. Escalation threatens the very interests the presence was designed to protect. The machine consumes its own logic. The strike that killed American troops must be understood through this lens. It was not merely an attack, it was a test of the architecture. It asked a question. What is the real cost of forward presence when the adversary has mastered cheap, scalable, deniable strike capability? The answer is being calculated now in Washington. But the calculation must account for the system that created the vulnerability in the first place. Changing the response without changing the architecture leaves the next strike inevitable. Changing the architecture, removing the troops, hardening the bases, altering the posture changes the strategic equation entirely. This is the hidden mechanism behind the headlines. The troops died because a system designed for a different era, against different threats, with different cost structures, continues operating in a world that has outpaced it. The architecture of vulnerability protected nothing on the day of the strike. It only provided the target. The attack occurred at Tower 22. This is a logistics support site in northeastern Jordan, near the Syrian border. The base does not appear on most maps. It is not a combat outpost. It is a support node, housing, supply, and maintenance for the broader American presence in Syria. The location matters strategically. The border proximity allows rapid movement into Syrian operating areas while maintaining nominal separation from active conflict zones. This is the geography of gray zone warfare. The weapon was a drone, not a Predator or Reaper, the large American systems that cost millions and carry missiles. This was a loitering munition, sometimes called a kamikaze drone. These systems are small, slow, and inexpensive. They fly pre-programmed routes. They carry explosive payloads sufficient to destroy vehicles, damage structures, and kill personnel. They are disposable weapons designed for single use. The specific system was likely Iranian-designed. The Shahed 1, 3, 6, or a derivative. Iran manufactures these by the thousands. They have a range exceeding 1,000 kilometers. They cost approximately $20,000 per unit. They are difficult to detect on radar because they fly low and slow below the threshold where many air defense systems prioritize threats. They are difficult to distinguish from civilian traffic. They blend into electronic clutter. The strike succeeded because of 3 system failures that were not actually failures. They were design limitations accepted as trade-offs. First, identification. The drone approached from a direction where friendly aircraft sometimes operate. Electronic signatures overlapped with permitted traffic. The defense system, human operators, and automated sensors had seconds to classify. Classification requires pattern recognition built from previous encounters. New approach vectors, new timing, new signatures create uncertainty. Uncertainty creates hesitation. Second, prioritization. Air defense operates on threat hierarchy. Fast-moving missiles take precedence. Aircraft with identified hostile intent take precedence. A small drone approaching a support base, not a command center, not an airfield, ranks lower. This is rational resource allocation. It is also exploitable. Third, saturation. The attack may have involved multiple drones. Even if only one carried explosives, others could have served as decoys, drawing defensive attention, consuming interceptor missiles, creating temporal windows. The defense system has finite capacity. Finite capacity creates arithmetic vulnerabilities. The result? 3 American soldiers killed, over 30 wounded. The first American military deaths from hostile fire in the region since the Gaza conflict began. The mechanism worked exactly as designed by the attackers. To understand why this matters beyond the immediate casualties, one must examine the economics of drone warfare. This is a system-level transformation in military cost structures. Traditional air defense was built against traditional threats. Aircraft are expensive. Pilots are expensive. Nations field limited numbers of both. Destroying an aircraft removes significant capital investment and irreplaceable human expertise. The incentive structure favored defense. Spending millions to protect assets worth billions made mathematical sense. Drones invert this structure. The attacker spends thousands. The defender must spend millions to guarantee protection or accept risk. Risk acceptance becomes the rational economic choice until casualties force reconsideration. Iran has mastered this inversion. Iranian strategy operates through plausible deniability and cost asymmetry. The drone that struck Tower 22 was likely launched by an Iranian proxy militia operating in Iraq or Syria. The militia provides geographic positioning. Iran provides technology, training, and targeting intelligence. The result is state-level strike capability with militia-level attribution difficulty. This is proxy warfare evolved. Traditional proxies carried rifles and rockets. Modern proxies carry precision-guided munitions with strategic range. The patron remains concealed. The weapon achieves effect. The response lacks clear target. The strike also tested American defensive posture across multiple bases simultaneously. Reports indicate coordinated drone approaches at several locations. Most were intercepted or failed. One succeeded. This is sufficient for strategic assessment. The defense system revealed its capacity and its limits. The attackers gathered data for future operations. The timing carried additional signaling. The strike occurred during ongoing American strikes against Iranian proxy positions in Iraq and Syria. These American strikes were themselves responses to previous proxy attacks on shipping and bases. The cycle is visible: attack, response, escalation, counter-escalation. Each iteration tests thresholds. The drone strike pushed the threshold specifically. It targeted American personnel directly. Previous attacks damaged infrastructure, wounded contractors, threatened positions. Killing uniformed service members crosses a line that Washington had declared protected. The declaration created the target. The protection became the vulnerability. Tower 22's specific function as a logistics node reveals targeting logic. Logistics is the sinew of military presence. Personnel rotate through support sites. Supplies concentrate there. Medical facilities treat casualties there. Striking logistics degrades operational capacity without requiring confrontation with combat units. It is efficient targeting within the architecture of vulnerability. The weapon's characteristics also matter for future assessment. The Shahed 136 carries a warhead approximately 40 kilograms. This is not devastating by conventional munitions standards. It cannot destroy hardened structures. It can penetrate soft targets, tents, unarmored vehicles, barracks, housing, sleeping personnel. The damage profile matches the target selection. The strike was calculated for casualties, not infrastructure destruction. Iranian drone doctrine emphasizes psychological effect alongside physical damage. The message is, we can reach you anywhere, at any time, with weapons you cannot afford to defend against universally. The message is not sent through statements, it is sent through corpses. American defensive responses to this doctrine are constrained by the same cost asymmetry that enables the threat. Comprehensive protection of all positions would require persistent airborne radar coverage, short-range interceptor systems at every node, electronic warfare packages with dedicated power and personnel, hardened shelters for all personnel. The cost would exceed the cost of the presence itself. The political will for such expenditure does not exist. The strategic value of the Syrian presence does not justify it. This is the trap. The mission continues, the vulnerability persists, the attacks escalate, the defense remains economically irrational. The strike at Tower 22 therefore represents not an operational surprise, but a strategic confirmation. The system of forward presence, tripwire deterrence, and limited hardening has encountered an adversary who understands its economics better than its architects. The adversary does not need to win militarily. They need to raise costs until the architects abandon the system. 3 dead Americans are not merely casualties. They are data points in this cost calculation. The calculation now moves to Washington, where the response architecture awaits activation. The phrase total response carries strategic weight that exceeds its rhetorical surface. In Washington's lexicon, this formulation signals not merely retaliation, but recalibration. It announces that previous constraints no longer bind, that the cost-benefit analysis has shifted, and that the adversary has miscalculated the threshold for American escalation. Understanding what follows requires examining the machinery itself, the systematic process by which tactical events translate into strategic decisions. The escalation ladder has discrete rungs. Each rung represents a category of response, with associated risks, timelines, and signaling properties. The ladder is not climbed automatically. It is climbed deliberately, with each step calculated for effect on multiple audiences simultaneously. Rung 1. Immediate retaliatory strikes. The first mechanism activates within hours or days. These strikes target the immediate perpetrators, proxy, militia positions, weapons depots, command nodes, and logistics chains in Iraq and Syria. The targeting is specific. The munitions are precise. The message is, your attack has immediate, visible, painful consequences. American forces have conducted such strikes repeatedly. Between October 2023 and January 2024, over 150 strikes hit Iranian proxy positions. These operations follow a pattern: intelligence identification, legal authorization under self-defense frameworks, execution by manned aircraft or drones, and post-strike assessment. The limitation of this rung is evident. It punishes proxies while sparing the patron. Iran calculates that proxy losses are acceptable costs. The militias are replaceable. Their equipment is replaceable. The deterrent effect degrades with repetition. The adversary adapts, dispersing, concealing, accepting higher risk. The total response declaration suggests movement beyond this rung, not abandonment of proxy targeting, but supplementation with higher-order mechanisms. Rung 2. Iranian direct targeting. This represents qualitative escalation. Striking Iranian territory, military facilities, Revolutionary Guard positions, weapons production sites removes the buffer of deniability. It confronts the state sponsor directly. The machinery for this exists. Target packages for Iranian locations are maintained continuously. Intelligence assets monitor Iranian military installations. Strike aircraft can reach Iranian territory from regional bases and carrier positions. The capability is not the constraint. The constraint is strategic consequence. Iranian territory strikes risk. Regional war expansion. Iranian retaliation against Gulf energy infrastructure. Closure of Strait of Hormuz, approximately 20% of global oil shipments. Activation of Hezbollah's massive rocket arsenal against Israel. Russian and Chinese diplomatic alignment with Tehran. The total response framing must navigate this constraint. It signals willingness to climb higher while managing the climb's speed. The declaration itself is mechanism. It creates uncertainty in Tehran about which facilities, which cities, which capabilities might face destruction. Rung 3. Proxy network systematic dismantlement. This mechanism operates across time rather than in single strikes. It involves sustained campaign against the entire architecture of Iranian regional influence, weapons smuggling routes, training camps, financial networks, command communications, and recruitment pipelines. The systematic approach transforms the conflict from episodic exchange into attritional warfare. It accepts that deterrence cannot be restored through single demonstrations. It requires dismantling the adversary's capacity to threaten. This rung demands intelligence dominance, persistent operations, and tolerance for extended engagement. It also risks regional instability, failed states, refugee flows, power vacuums filled by worse actors. The machinery is powerful but imprecise. Rung 4. Economic warfare expansion. Sanctions represent financial escalation parallel to military mechanisms. The architecture of sanctions against Iran is already extensive. Total response implies expansion. Secondary sanctions on entities trading with Iran, pressure on remaining oil export routes, interdiction of weapons component shipments, and financial isolation of Revolutionary Guard business networks. The economic machinery operates through the global financial system. Dollar dominance, swift network access, and correspondent banking relationships become weapons. Nations and corporations face binary choice. access American markets or Iranian markets. The architecture forces alignment. Economic escalation has delayed effects. It does not satisfy immediate demands for visible response. It complements military mechanisms rather than replacing them. Rung 5. Regional force posture transformation. This mechanism alters the physical American presence itself. Options include reinforcement of base defenses, accepting the cost asymmetry previously rejected. Troop withdrawals from most vulnerable positions, reducing targets but reducing influence. Expansion of presence to threaten Iranian flanks. Maritime forces in Persian Gulf. Ground forces in threatening positions. Nuclear posture signaling, ambiguous messaging about strategic options. Each option transforms the strategic equation. Reinforcement accepts Iranian cost imposition logic. Withdrawal concedes strategic space. Expansion risks direct confrontation. Nuclear signaling introduces existential stakes. The total response declaration likely precedes some combination reinforcement of critical positions, sustained proxy targeting, limited Iranian direct strikes, and sanctions expansion. The combination is calibrated for deterrence restoration without regional war. The machinery includes critical timing considerations. Response too swift appears reactive, unconsidered, potentially disproportionate. Response too delayed appears weak, calculating, deterrence eroding. The optimal interval demonstrates deliberation while preserving urgency. Washington's promise of total response must also address domestic political requirements. American casualties demand visible consequence. The public audience requires demonstration that sacrifice produces effect. This political machinery constrains strategic options. Inaction is politically untenable. Overreaction is strategically dangerous. The narrow path requires sufficient violence to satisfy domestic demand, while sufficient restraint to prevent regional catastrophe. The international audience matters equally. Allies Israel, Gulf states, European partners must see reliable commitment. Adversaries, Russia, China, North Korea, must see controlled capability. The response signals American strategic discipline or its absence. Iran's countermachinery awaits activation. They have prepared responses for each rung: proxy escalation, maritime harassment, cyber operations, regional missile launches. The total response declaration initiates a competitive calculation. Each side estimates the other's pain tolerance, risk acceptance, and commitment level. The machinery runs on these estimates. The critical insight: total response is not an endpoint. It is a transition point. It announces that the previous equilibrium tolerable proxy harassment, managed escalation, limited American casualties has collapsed. A new equilibrium must be established. The violence required to establish it depends on both sides' willingness to climb. The 3 dead soldiers at Tower 22 have therefore initiated machinery that may consume far more lives, far more resources, and far more strategic position than their individual deaths represent. This is how tripwires function. Small events trigger large mechanisms. The architecture of vulnerability produces not just targets, but escalatory spirals. The strike at Tower 22 and the promised American response do not occur in isolation. They occur on a chessboard where multiple powers simultaneously calculate their interests, adjust their positions, and prepare for the consequences of others' moves. Understanding the strategic system requires mapping these concurrent calculations across the Middle East and beyond. Iran, the patron under pressure. Iran faces a strategic dilemma. The drone strike achieved tactical success, American casualties, international attention, demonstration of reach. But tactical success creates strategic exposure. Washington's total response threatens Iranian assets directly, potentially including Iranian territory. Iran's regional proxy network, formerly called the Axis of Resistance, serves specific functions. It extends Iranian influence without requiring Iranian military presence. It creates pressure on adversaries through deniable, plausibly controllable violence. It provides leverage in negotiations by offering the possibility of de-escalation. The network includes Hezbollah in Lebanon, most capable, with estimated 150,000 rockets. Hamas in Gaza, currently engaged in direct conflict with Israel. Houthis in Yemen, disrupting Red Sea shipping. Multiple militias in Iraq, targeting American bases. Militias in Syria, including those near Tower 22. Each proxy serves distinct geographic and political purposes, but each proxy also creates exposure. If Washington shifts from proxy targeting to patron targeting, Iran must calculate whether the network's benefits exceed its costs. Iran's nuclear program adds complexity. The program has advanced significantly since American withdrawal from the 2015 agreement. Enrichment levels now approach weapons grade. The timeline for potential weaponization has compressed. This creates both deterrence, attack Iran, and face nuclear future, and vulnerability, Israeli preventive strike, becomes more likely as timeline shortens. The Total Response Declaration forces Iranian leadership to weigh immediate defiance against long-term preservation. Their countermoves will attempt to demonstrate continued capability while avoiding direct confrontation that triggers American rung climbing. Israel, the ally with independent interests. Israel calculates separately from Washington, though coordination exists. The Israeli interest is Iranian nuclear rollback and proxy disarmament. American strikes against Iranian targets serve Israeli interests, regardless of whether they serve broader American strategic goals. Israel maintains independent strike capability against Iranian nuclear facilities. Previous operations, sabotage, assassinations, cyber attacks demonstrate this. A major American escalation might trigger Israeli complementary action, or Israeli action might trigger American involvement. The distinction matters operationally, but blurs strategically. Israel's ongoing Gaza operations constrain its freedom of action. Military resources are committed. International diplomatic pressure is intense. Opening northern front against Hezbollah, long anticipated, remains risky while Gaza continues. Iranian escalation through Hezbollah, therefore, carries asymmetric threat. Israel can be forced into two-front war at moment of Iranian choosing. The Gulf states. Calculating survival. Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and Kuwait occupy strategic position between Iran and American forces. Their calculation centers on survival through balancing. These states host American military facilities. These bases provide American regional presence but create targeting opportunities for Iran. The states seek American protection while fearing American-Iranian war that engulfs them. Recent diplomatic shifts complicate this. Saudi-Iranian rapprochement, brokered by China in 2023, reduced immediate Gulf-Iranian tensions. The total response threatens to reignite these tensions. Gulf states must calculate whether to support American operations, remain neutral, or quietly constrain American action through base access limitations. Energy markets amplify their concern. Iranian threats to Hormuz closure, Houthi Red Sea attacks, and general regional instability directly impact Gulf export capacity. The states profit from high prices, but suffer from supply disruption. Their optimal outcome: American pressure on Iran, sufficient to restrain Iranian ambition, insufficient to trigger regional war. Russia, the opportunist. Russia maintains strategic relationship with Iran dating to Syrian civil war. Russian forces in Syria coordinate with Iranian proxies. Russian weapons technology drones. Air defense supports Iranian capabilities. The Ukraine conflict has transformed Russian interests. Russia now requires Iranian weapons, drones, missiles to sustain its own operations. This reverses the patron-client relationship in military supply. Russia becomes dependent. American-Iranian escalation serves Russian interests. It diverts American attention and resources from Europe. It potentially creates American casualties that reduce American willingness to engage elsewhere. It demonstrates American entanglement in Middle East quagmire that Russia has long criticized. Russian response to total response will likely be diplomatic United Nations condemnation, calls for restraint, offers of mediation while continuing military support for Iran. Russia will not directly confront American forces for Iranian interests. Russia will profit from American distraction. China. The long-term player. China imports approximately half its oil from the Middle East. Energy security drives Chinese strategic interest, but China's approach emphasizes stability over alignment. China brokered Saudi-Iranian rapprochement. This demonstrated diplomatic capability independent of American frameworks. China seeks regional reputation as mediator rather than combatant. American-Iranian escalation threatens Chinese energy supplies and economic interests. Chinese response will emphasize de-escalation, respect for sovereignty, and opposition to unilateral military action. China will not militarily support Iran. China will not support American strikes. China will position itself as responsible alternative to American hegemony. The strategic consequence: American escalation isolates Washington diplomatically, provides China reputation-building opportunities, and demonstrates the costs of Middle East military commitment that China explicitly rejects. The non-state actors: acceleration and chaos. Beyond state calculations, multiple armed groups observe the Total Response Declaration for opportunity. Islamic State remnants in Syria and Iraq may exploit American-Iranian focus on each other to regenerate capability. Kurdish forces' American partners face Turkish pressure, Iranian pressure, and Syrian regime pressure simultaneously. Their position becomes more precarious as American attention shifts. Iraqi government faces existential tension. It hosts American forces at government invitation for counterterrorism purposes. It faces parliamentary and popular pressure to expel those forces, especially if American strikes kill Iraqis. The total response may accelerate Iraqi demands for American withdrawal, achieving Iranian strategic goal through political rather than military means. The systemic effect: the regional chessboard demonstrates that the Tower 22 strike and Washington's response operate within interconnected system. Actions against Iran affect Israeli calculations. Israeli calculations affect Lebanese stability. Lebanese stability affects Syrian dynamics. Syrian dynamics affect Iraqi politics. Iraqi politics affect American basing rights. The total response machinery must calculate these second and third order effects. Striking Iranian weapons shipments in Syria affects Syrian regime stability. Syrian regime instability affects Russian interests. Russian response affects Ukraine conflict. Ukraine conflict affects NATO cohesion. NATO cohesion affects Pacific deterrence. This is the architecture of global strategic systems. Local events propagate. Regional responses transform. Global consequences emerge from specific tactical decisions made in response to drone strikes on remote bases. The 3 American deaths have therefore initiated competitive calculation across multiple powers. Each calculates risk and opportunity. Each prepares for others' moves. The chessboard awaits the first major peace movement promised by total response. The systems examined across this analysis: forward deployment architecture, drone warfare economics, escalation machinery, and regional competitive calculation converge on a single structural transformation. The cost of maintaining American military presence in the Middle East has fundamentally changed. The cost of attacking that presence has simultaneously declined. This inversion defines the strategic challenge facing Washington and explains why the Tower 22 strike represents more than an isolated tragedy. The mathematics of presence. American forward deployment operates on an economic model established during the Cold War. The model assumes that presence deters adversaries more cheaply than absence would invite aggression. A tripwire force prevents major war by demonstrating commitment. The cost of the tripwire is acceptable insurance against the catastrophic cost of large-scale conflict. This model requires 2 conditions. First, the adversary must believe that tripwire casualties trigger massive response. Second, the adversary must lack cost-effective means to attack the tripwire itself. Both conditions have eroded. Iranian strategy explicitly rejects the first condition's validity. Tehran calculates that American domestic politics, regional war weariness, and global strategic priorities constrain massive response. Limited strikes against limited targets produce limited American retaliation. The tripwire burns without triggering the promised explosion. Drone technology destroys the second condition. Previously, attacking American bases required capabilities, aircraft, missiles, special forces that only states possessed. States could be deterred through retaliation threats. Non-state actors lacked means. The means gap protected American positions. Drones eliminate the gap. A militia with Iranian technical support can deploy weapon systems with state-level reach and precision. The $20,000 drone destroys the $3 million defense. The militia replaces drones faster than the defender replaces interceptors. The arithmetic is relentless. The asymmetry deepens. The cost divergence extends beyond immediate strike and defense. Each American casualty generates domestic political pressure for response. Response requires military operations. Operations consume resources, attention, and strategic flexibility. The adversary spends thousands. America spends millions in immediate response. plus the incalculable cost of strategic distraction from other priorities. Consider opportunity cost. American military resources committed to Middle East escalation are unavailable for Pacific deterrence, European reassurance, or domestic requirements. Every aircraft carrier in the Persian Gulf is absent from the South China Sea. Every intelligence asset tracking Iranian drones is not tracking Chinese shipbuilding. The adversary achieves strategic displacement at minimal expense. Iranian proxy networks compound this asymmetry. The network is distributed across multiple countries. Destruction in one location does not destroy the network. Regeneration is rapid. Patron support weapons, funding, training flows through established channels. American strikes against proxies degrade without defeating. The network's resilience consumes American offensive capacity in tactical success without strategic victory. The architecture's unsustainability. The Tower 22 strike reveals that the current architecture, expeditionary bases, limited hardening, tripwire presence, proxy-dependent defense, cannot achieve its stated purposes. Deterrence fails because the adversary calculates that attacks are tolerable. Protection fails because cost-effective defense is impossible. Presence becomes vulnerability without compensating strategic benefit. The Syrian deployment exemplifies this unsustainability. 900 troops in eastern Syria serve counterterrorism objectives against Islamic State remnants. They block Iranian land bridge to Lebanon. They maintain American influence in post-Civil War territorial division. These are real but limited benefits. Against these benefits, the costs accumulate. Persistent exposure to drone and rocket attack, requirement for defensive resources that exceed the deployment's value, risk of casualties that demand response, and strategic distraction from higher priority theaters. The balance has shifted. The deployment now costs more than it secures. Similar calculations apply across the region. Iraqi bases face identical threats. Gulf facilities face missile and drone threats. Even Jordan, host to Tower 22, historically stable, strategically significant, proves vulnerable. No location within Iranian proxy reach offers acceptable security at acceptable cost. The strategic choice. Washington faces three options, each with distinct cost profiles. Option 1. Reinforcement. Accept the cost asymmetry and invest in comprehensive defense. Deploy layered air defense at every node. Harden all personnel facilities. Accept the billions in expenditure. This option preserves presence but validates Iranian cost imposition strategy. Iran forces American resource allocation to Middle East defense rather than other priorities. Reinforcement is tactical solution to strategic problem. Option 2. Withdrawal. Remove forces from most vulnerable positions. Accept reduced regional influence. Abandon tripwire strategy. This option eliminates the vulnerability but creates alternative costs. Ally abandonment, adversary emboldenment, terrorist regeneration, and global reputation erosion. Withdrawal is strategic solution with tactical consequences. Option 3. Escalation dominance. Pursue the total response logic to its conclusion. Systematically dismantle Iranian proxy capability. Strike Iranian territory if necessary. Accept regional war risk to re-establish deterrence. This option attempts to restore the tripwire's credibility by demonstrating that attacks trigger overwhelming, decisive, war-winning response rather than limited retaliation. Each option carries costs that exceed the pre-strike equilibrium. This is Iranian strategic success. They have forced American choice among undesirable alternatives. The status quo presence, without vulnerability, no longer exists. The broader pattern. This cost equation appears beyond the Middle East. Similar dynamics operate in the Pacific, where Chinese missile systems threaten American bases. Similar dynamics operate in Eastern Europe, where Russian capabilities challenge forward NATO positions. The drone and missile revolution, cheap, accurate, scalable, transforms defense economics globally. The American military was designed for power projection, moving forces to distant theaters, establishing presence, controlling territory and seas. The new technologies favor area denial, preventing that projection through distributed, inexpensive threats. The strategic advantage shifts toward defenders of territory and away from distant power projectors. Tower 22 sits at this historical inflection point. The strike demonstrates that small forces in forward positions, once symbols of strength, have become liabilities. The response machinery, however effective tactically, cannot restore the strategic position. The total response promises to punish the attacker, but cannot rebuild the architecture that invited attack. The structural conclusion. The 3 American soldiers killed at Tower 22 died because a strategic system designed for different adversaries, different technologies, different cost structures continued operating past its viability. Their deaths force recognition that the system has ended. What replaces it will determine American security and global order for decades. The new cost equation is simple to state and difficult to accept. Presence has become more expensive than absence. Defense has become more expensive than attack. Deterrence has become more expensive than the threats it prevents. Until Washington restructures its global posture around these realities, the architecture of vulnerability will continue producing casualties, responses, and strategic drift. The machinery of total response will activate. Targets will be struck. Deterrence will be attempted. But the underlying transformation, the cheapening of attack, the expense of defense, the unsustainability of forward presence will persist. The Tower 22 strike was not an anomaly. It was an early signal of the new strategic mathematics.